As developers, we're no strangers to containerization. Especially if you're a web developer, Docker is a common name when it comes to deployment. But what if you wanted to use a container for local development as well? Theoretically, it could make deployment easier, and you don't have to fiddle with your system's packages to get your project running. So this is where DevContainers comes in. They're a tool that lets you use a Docker container as a full-fledged development environment. In this video, you're going to learn how to use DevContainers in your workflow. So the first step for you should be to create a dev container. To make this possible, open the command palette, you go to DevContainers, and then add dev container configuration file. Press enter. And then you can add your configuration depending on where you want it, on your workspace or user data folder. Today, I'll do it with workspace. If you want, you can use it with a template. I'll choose a standard Ubuntu template and then your version. So of course, I will use Jammy. If you want, you can also get additional features, but I don't want additional features. We can look at features later on in this video. To skip, press OK. Press OK again. And let's wait. Okay, so VS Code has now built our dev container. So as you can see in the image, we have an Ubuntu base as an image, and then there are other features or there are other properties that we can change. But we'll look at properties later. To open this project, to open this folder, you can open command palette again and then rebuild and reopen in container. Now that it has been built, let's open the command line and let's see if we're actually running on Ubuntu. To look at your Ubuntu release, I'll type this command lsb release-a. So as you can see, we're actually running Ubuntu, even though I'm not using Ubuntu on my local PC. I'm using Fedora Linux 42. Next, what if you wanted to install extensions on your PC? So let's look at extensions. So as you can see, there are some extensions already installed as part of the Ubuntu image. But if you wanted to install further extensions, you could either install it through the VS Code extension marketplace, or you could configure your devcontainer.json file. To add extensions to your dev container, you can simply go back to your devcontainer.json file and then change customizations, and then VS Code, so VS Code specific stuff, and then you can add your extensions. So extensions, and then what kind of extensions I want. So if I'm using Python, I'll use ms-python.black formatter, and then my next extension, if I'm using JavaScript, I can get prettier. So as bnp.prettier-VS Code. Now I have to add my comma. To rebuild your container, go back to your command palette, rebuild container. Now let's check if extensions have been installed on this dev container. So as you can see, I have Prettier and I have my black formatter now installed in my dev container. Now let's try running a project here. So if I write app.py and then I do print hello world, let's try running it. So I want to check if I have Python on my PC. So Python 3. And then the name of my Python file, so app.py. But we can even enhance it with features. So what if I want to install Node in this image? You can do this via a Dockerfile, but we'll get to Dockerfile later on in this video. For features, you uncomment this property, and then we can add other features. A complete list of features are already documented in the containers.dev website. But for this video, I will first choose for conda, and I'll opt for NVM, which is around here. So let's copy this to our features array. Now that I've added these properties to my features object, I'll rebuild the container. Now that I've rebuilt my dev container, let's try to check if I have conda on my machine, on my dev container. Cool, so it looks like I have conda installed. Let's check if I have node as well. Okay, so I have node as well. Let's try building a little app using dev containers. To start with, I'll try building a Python Flask app, and I'll also build a React frontend. Let's create a folder, backend. Within backend, I'll move my app.py file. And then here, I'll add some code to create a Flask backend endpoint. So now I've coded a Python project off screen, and then let's try running it. But before that, I would like to create a Conda environment. Since I have Conda already installed in my dev container, I can basically create an environment using my Conda extension. So dev containers or Python create environment, Conda. Then I can choose my Python version. Now that my dev container has created my Conda environment, let's try reusing it. So within my Conda environment, I can do pip install Flask. Now that I've installed Flask in my environment, I can simply run it by going into my backend folder and then Flask run. Now let's see if I can go to my port within the dev container. Nice. So as you can see, it's running fine. Let's try to use localhost. Maybe let's try creating a front-end project within a dev container. To create a front-end project, I'll go back and then I'll create a new directory. So make directory front-end. Within front-end, I'll use Vite to create a React app. So npm create Vite latest. Yes, let's call it dot. So within my directory React, let's use TypeScript. So we are in front end already, and then npm install, and then let's try running it. Let's go to localhost, open in browser. So as you can see, Vite cannot open a React app, or maybe it's the dev container's fault. You can fix it by going to your front end folder, go to Vite config, and then here you configure your server where we want our host to be a specific IP address. So in this case, it's going to be 127.0.0.1. Let's see if we can now run our project within our browser. Cool. So as you can see, our code now works. One more feature is that VS Code automatically tells you what ports is going to forward. But if you're exporting this dev container to other developers, it would be nice to document all the ports that you want to forward. To make this possible, you go to devcontainer.json. So here you have the forward ports property. Here you can specify the ports you want to forward. For example, our Python project was running at port 5000, and our React project is running on port 5173. And then let's rebuild it. Now within our ports view, as you can see, all of our forwarded ports are now available. As discussed earlier, maybe there are certain changes that you want to make in your dev container. Maybe you want to install Git, or you want to install other tools that are not available as a feature. For this, we can use a Docker file. So within your dev container directory, you create a new file, call it Dockerfile. So let's try to extend our dev container image. So I'll take my previous image that I was using, so from, then my dev container image, which is Ubuntu. Then I will install some piece of software, so apt-get update, and then I would like to install, for example, ffmpeg. Maybe I want to transcode something or encode video. Okay, so now I have a Docker file, but how do I include it in my dev container? Go back to a dev container. Let's comment this out. Build. Then we have something called Dockerfile, and then the name of our Docker file, which is Dockerfile. Let's try rebuilding this. Go back to the command palette and then rebuild container. Now that our container has been created, let's check if ffmpeg has been installed. As you can see, ffmpeg is now located within our image. And of course, since this is our Docker container with our specified features, we can still use our conda environment and our node run engine. So for example, let's check again if our Python project is running fine. So flask run, and then let's click on this URL or open in browser. There might be certain cases where you want to use a Docker Compose. For example, maybe you want to use a MongoDB database within this container. So of course, DevContainers allows you to use Docker Compose within your dev container. Within your dev container, create a new file called docker-compose.yml. So within our Docker file, I'll now define two services. So first, to define a service will be my dev container. So I'll just create a dev container. And then my image, so it's going to be a variant, or it's going to derive from my Ubuntu image, which I can get from my Docker file. So I'll copy it from here and then I'll paste it here. Next, I want to keep my container consistent with my files, with my host files. So then I'll create a volume, volumes, and then my workspace folder, and then the location in my container, which is workspaces, which should be cached. Let's now define our database service. So my first database, I'll bring it from the Mongo image. Then I create another policy that I don't want my MongoDB container to restart unless I've stopped it. So unless stop. Let's now create a volume for it because I want it to be persistent on my disk. So Mongo data/data/db. I have to rename this to volume. So of course, now I need to define my environment variables. For example, my username and my password. So environment, MongoDB, initdb, root, username. Let's call it Mongo admin, Mongo initdb, root, and then password. Let's call it secret. Now I have to name my volumes. So volumes, Mongo-data. But we're not done yet. We now need to configure our network. So I'll go here and then I'll configure my network mode. So network mode service db. This essentially says that I want my dev container to be on the same network as my database. And then I want a command sleep infinity, which says that I don't want my container to shut down as soon as it's done. Let's save it. So how do we include this Docker Compose file within my dev container? Go to dev container. Let's comment this out. Let's now define a Docker Compose file. So Docker Compose file, docker-compose.yml, and then my service. So the name of my service. So in this case, it was dev container. So I'll copy it here, and then my workspace folder. It's going to be workspaces, and then the name of my current folder. So local workspace folder base name. Let's now rebuild and reopen this project within the container. Now that we have built our MongoDB container, let's now try using it in our Python project. First, I need to install pymongo. So pip install pymongo, and then let's import it. So import pymongo, and then I need to create a client instance. So I'll call it my client, pymongo.mongo client, and then we need to connect to it. So MongoDB, Mongo admin, so my username, and then my password, so secret, then my host, which is localhost, and then my port, which is 2717. This is the default port for MongoDB databases. Now I need to create my database. So my DB is my client, and let's call it nodes DB. Then I need to create a collection. So nodes collection, my DB nodes collection. Let's now try inserting a node into my database. So I'll create a node, call it node1, which will be an object title. Hey, this is a node. Then let's give it an ID. of 1. So to insert it, I just go nodes collection dot insert many, then I add my note 1. We can also check how many databases I have in my MongoDB instance. So I just do db names, comma, my client dot list database name. And of course, I want to check how many nodes or what kind of nodes I have in my database. So for item in nodes collection dot find, I just print item. Let's try running this project. As soon as I run my project, notice that I have NodesDB now created into my database. Open in browser. Now that my endpoint is opened, notice that my note is now inserted into the database. There's another use case. What if you want to use your existing Docker file with your Docker Compose? Well, that's very easy. To make this possible, go to your Docker Compose. I'll just comment this out. So build, and then my context, so my directory, which is the current directory, and then the name of my Docker file, so Dockerfile, Dockerfile. That's it. Let's now try rebuilding and rerunning this dev container. Now that I'm in a Docker file, recall that I installed ffmpeg in my container. So this time, let's check if I have ffmpeg now. As included in my Docker file, I have ffmpeg, and then I included this Docker file within my compose.yml file. So that's it about dev containers. If you have any questions, just let me know. Till then, bye bye.